thank you very much. I am honored to be here. So I'm based here in the Bay Area, so Oakland, California. GitHub itself is based in San Francisco, but we're a very remote-friendly company. So I think for most of us, we're all using pretty much GitHub. GitHub is we've been around for 10 years. We're based here in the Bay, as I mentioned. We're really focused around focused around collaboration with developers. As I mentioned, my team, or myself, I work in San Francisco. No one in my team here in San Francisco actually lives in San Francisco. Like my closest teammate is in New York, and then my next closest teammate is in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. So my entire team's pretty much spread across the globe. And I think it's kind of normal for a lot of teams at GitHub because we're really into remote working. And I think at Andela, you guys kind of see this firsthand because you guys tend to work on a lot of different types of projects once you end up getting a job, but also while you're collaborating. Like even on this call, we have so many people across the country, or the continent of Africa. So the cool thing about GitHub is that you don't have to be side by side, you don't have to be next to each other, and you can actually have that collaboration effort. So that's GitHub, that's what we do. Again, I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with it at this point. If you're not, definitely check it out. We were recently acquired by Microsoft too. That's a big thing that people like to ask questions about a lot. As far as that, nothing's changed. The only thing that's changed is that we have a new CEO and then we have a lot more money. So that's like the two biggest changes. But going back to what I was talking about, the collaboration effort, like the GitHub workflow, it provides a better workflow. So when you think of like Google Drive or think about Dropbox, back in the day, people would like hold on the files and you would claim that file, like with SVN, you would like to just claim that file and you'd have to write that file, and no one else could commit to that file or commit to that project while you're writing on it. And I think with Google Drive, everybody can commit the file at the same time, but then you have the problem where everybody conflicts at the same time trying to write the same stuff. So when you're writing code, Git solves that problem much better because you have the idea of branches. So my workflow can be different from you. Like when I do a new feature and we're working in the same team, I might open up a pull request earlier. You might wait for like 3 weeks to open up a pull request. So it's all based on your workflow and your personal preference. But at the end of the day, we can merge all of our changes into the same master branch, which is great. So want to introduce my title too as well, developer advocate. I'm curious, like the show of hands, like yes, thumbs down, thumbs no, if you guys are familiar with the term developer advocate. It is a term that's been around for quite some time. It's kind of popularized by Google, kind of had the first advocates. And I think with engineering and developers, full-time you write code, and then part-time you'll do talks like this, or you write a blog post, or you share some content or show up at events and represent your company. I do all that stuff full-time and I write code part-time. So more of like 25% of my time is committing code and helping out with projects. Some of the projects I'll be talking about here. But a lot of my efforts is around building a story around new features, new interactions with our API and our platform. These are all my social handles too. Twitter and GitHub's right here too as well. And it's kind of sum up like what my role is if you guys are all familiar with Beyonce, she's a prominent star here in the States. Actually, she's a global star at this point. She's came through a Destiny's Child and then became her own thing, her own superstar. And Beyonce, she has a group called the Beehive, and she is collectively called Queen Bee by that group. And I like to call myself Queen Bee at GitHub. So I'm basically the Beyonce at GitHub. And not that I'm like a superstar or anything like that. I'm more of sort of like the central point of all our developers. So I do have another teammate who is based in Amsterdam that covers all Europe. We share Asia and Africa on events. But Beyonce's Beehive, they're a powerful group. Like just like developers at GitHub are a powerful group. So we have 31 worldwide developers across the globe. Similar to like Beyonce's Beehive, which is not as close of a number, but it's pretty high. And Beyonce constantly has to ask the question. Actually, Beyonce supports her Beehive. So she not only does she have like a super fan group, which is the Beehive, but she also pulls out. She just recently started this mentor program. So if you're an aspiring artist, you can actually apply to become part of her program and become sort of like the next top superstar. So I don't do that specifically, but I do ask myself every day, what would Bay do? And how would she sort of lead the Hive and lead these 31 million developers and engage them and sort of activate them and different things that they could probably be doing on GitHub. So to kind of sum up that whole introduction is I go to bat for the Hive. I'm here to hear your feedback on our platform. I'm here to hear about problems for our documentation or just wins about how you built something on GitHub and how it's sort of improved your workflow. So that's the whole purpose of me being here, me talking to you, me sharing this content. And my sole focus is around GitHub's ecosystem, which really means GitHub's API. So GitHub is that GitHub.com's been around for 10 years, but GitHub's API has been around for 10 years as long. So GitHub, like 3 months after GitHub launched their first feature, which was like the pull request, and became like an official company, GitHub decided to also open up an API so that way people can engage the platform firsthand, which is awesome because of that, people were able to engage us, but also engage our platform to improve their workflows, like from almost pretty close to day one. And with that, we have like a very large open source community as well. So if you've ever done open source or you're familiar with open source, it's definitely a thing that's here to stay. And GitHub's kind of been driving that sort of popularity of open source. So about 3 years ago, all the open source contributors got together and said, hey, we have problems with GitHub. There's like certain features missing. There's certain things that could make our lives much better and easier. And I know you're a company that's making money, but here's a list of things that we would like to see. And we took that to heart too, actually. We took a week to think about it, and then we took like another week to sort of draw out our conclusions and how we would sort of solve these problems. And there's like this, there's a saying here in the States, which is like, if life gives you lemons, then make lemonade. And that's literally what we did. So Beyonce's last album was called Lemonade. Actually, her second to last album, she did create a new album with Jay-Z. But the album before was called Lemonade. So that's the sort of perpetuating my joke there. But so to help solve that problem, we've actually shipped a lot of features. Actually, every single feature from this note and this list of things that people wanted, we pushed out. And like this whole letter is complete like defunct now. We've solved that at this point. But we wanted to leverage that thought and then also build a platform where people can continue to build their own features and sort of leverage the GitHub API to solve some of their workflow sort of nuances. So this talk, it's about automating your workflow with GitHub, and I'll show you how to do that in a sec. But as developers, like there's certain things that we'll do every single time. Like we all know we pretty much consistent with like git add, git commit, git push, like you did all the time. And then at the point of you pushing the commit, you open up a PR. And then when you open up the PR, more than likely you have to like, if you need to get approval from other people on the team, then you have to go into Slack or whatever communication services that you're using and say, hey, please look at my PR. Like it's ready to be looked at, which is redundant because that's a repeated task that we do all the time. So why do we have to like constantly always ping our teammates whenever we have a pull request open, or we need some code being reviewed, or we need feedback on something? So there's a solo developer based out of Chicago. He came up with the idea of, he was a CTO for a team, and he decided that every time he opened a pull request, his team would just go into Slack, drop the link to the pull request, and then mention someone and say, hey, pull request is available to read or to view, please look at it. And then if the next day would go by and no one would review it, he would add it again and be like, hey, pull request is ready to view, please look at it. And that was like a lot of time for developers to sort of like sit around and not really get any of their information or any of their pull requests reviewed. So he built this tool called pull reminders. He built this on the GitHub API. So he basically took that repeated task, which is like, we have a pull request, we review pull requests once a day. So one day, set aside like 30 minutes or an hour every time and review that pull request. And he built an entire platform around our API to do that. And he's doing very well, which is, at this point, that's his full-time job. He's making enough money for that to actually support himself. And yeah, it was a great opportunity. And he actually gave a talk at GitHub Universe just a couple months ago, if you want to check that out as well. But the way he did this is by using GitHub Apps. So GitHub Apps allowed integrators the flexibility to request specific resources to act as a first-class citizen on the organization. So essentially, a GitHub app is a bot. So you can have a bot. So normally, if you have to do send notifications based on pull requests, you would have to use someone's user account and then constantly take that pull request and send it to Slack. And that's tedious, because why is a human doing something so tedious as taking a link and putting in Slack? Why not have a bot do that? So he built a GitHub app, which essentially is a bot to provide that link to Slack automatically. And the cool thing about this is that we built a framework as well to get this done really easily. So the framework itself is called Probot. It's completely open source. Though it was created by one GitHub engineer, it's supported by the open source community. And we have a couple full-time staff that work on this full-time. We'd love to see this grow bigger, but until we have like more mass adoption, for the moment, it's just going to be maintained by open source contributors. And this is a way to kickstart your ideas like pull reminders, or ideas like anything else that you see a workflow corner case that you can solve. We have Probot to do that. And that's the URL for that. And I'll walk through how to build a Probot app too at the end of this too as well. But essentially what Probot is doing is listening to webhooks. So every time you trigger an event on GitHub, because we have an API, we're API first at GitHub, there will be a webhook. So every time you open an issue, every time you open a pull request, every time you add a comment to some code, or even just pushing to a branch, there's a webhook that gets fired. And with Probot, you can actually watch those webhooks run and then trigger actions based on that. So here's an example of one of my colleagues from last summer, actually one of our interns, who built a Probot application or a GitHub app to simply add a needs response label whenever an issue is open. So this is, if you've done any open source contributions or if you've maintained a large open source project, it's pretty tedious to take a bunch of issues, especially if your project gets super popular, like a talk like this, where you have 100 people on a call and everybody goes to there and opens up issues at the same time. Like I can't really open up 100, I can't really manage 100 issues, but when they have the needs response label added automatically, then you can kind of triage which issues were newer and which issues actually do need response. So if I were to come onto Bex's issue and write a response, I can remove that needs response, and then we know that's been already attended to, and then you can address ones that haven't. So as far as bandwidth goes, like as far as developers, going back to the pull request idea, like we don't want to spend all our time doing stuff that's not writing code. So all the tedious things like answering emails and looking at issues and adding labels to things, like if we can automate ourselves out of that job, then we can move forward to become better developers. Like that's pretty much the end goal, about automating your workflow. So I will mention too, this is the code that was written to make the previous slide work. We're talking 5 lines of code. This is JavaScript code. So I didn't mention Probot itself is all JavaScript. It's built on Node. And it leverages this other tool called OctaKit. So the logo next to the Probot logo is OctaKit. It's an open source framework to interact with the GitHub's API. So rather than build your own webhooks and your own interactions and functions, OctaKit's there for you to leverage and make your experience with the GitHub API much easier. And then on top of that, Probot uses OctaKit to then make those interactions with webhooks and GitHub Apps even easier too. So if you look in the first line, it's looking for the webhook, which is issues opened. And whenever an issue is open, it will add this label called needs response. So 5 lines of code, I could build an entire Probot app and improve my workflow. I do want to mention too is GitHub. We launched our newest feature. It's the biggest feature since pull request. So I mentioned pull request is the feature that launched GitHub as a product and as a company. Actions, there hasn't been anything as big as actions. On stage, I bring this up because on the announcement of actions a couple weeks ago, we mentioned that GitHub, we're in the business of providing enough features to support developers and to support their workflows, and then get out of the way. So GitHub itself doesn't want to be in the way of how you ship code. GitHub just wants to be the platform that you collaborate on code with. So with that being said, there are going to be some use cases for your workflow, maybe with your team that you could probably build a GitHub app with. So I highly recommend think of those and maybe even reach out to me or the Probot community to help support that. In addition to that, actions, the new feature, every Probot app can now be an action, and actions are just containerized workflows. So if you go, what I just explained with the 5 lines of code, it's a little more complicated with Docker containers, but you can do a lot more powerful things because you're actually using a server and a container to support that. But the cool thing about this is that Probot itself can just run on functions. So if you've ever used Lambdas or Azure functions or Google Cloud functions, you can actually deploy these simple Probot or GitHub apps directly to a function and have those deployed in perpetuity and it'll help those run. So the cool thing about that is that to run a bot on your workflow on GitHub, it can cost near to nothing. Actually, it costs pretty much zero because functions are pretty cheap to run. So I'll walk through some use cases for GitHub apps. And the way I'll do that is by explaining some API endpoints. There's a good chance, like I'm pretty confident that a lot of people probably here haven't really leveraged the GitHub API to do stuff. It's not as common, especially for most developers, unless you work in a developer company that uses GitHub. But the GitHub API is pretty easy to sort of jump in. So I highly recommend just check out the developer docs, see if there's something that you could build, or maybe there's an example that you can tweak or even support through open source. But with that being said, I want to talk about the checks API. So the checks API, a lot of people, if you've used Travis or if you've Circle, any sort of test runner on your GitHub project, we have this little box in the bottom of your pull request that provides context of what happens. So if your tests pass or if they fail, we'll tell you within the context of the commit status box. The checks API is a little different, where we're providing way more sophisticated feedback on those pass and fails. So normally just be like red or green if they passed, or yellow if it was like some sort of error. With the checks API, you can now go, we have a new tab on your pull request, and you can actually see way more data based on the failures. You can also provide feedback based on, like, if it was a failure, go ahead and do X or Y or Z. And that commit status, the thing I was sort of explaining, this is what it looks like. So with like Travis AI, Travis is a script runner. It'll run your tests, it'll run your linting. So if you have like white space or you have tabs or spaces, like you can, instead of complaining about that in engineering syncs or with your team, you can just let the machines just make those decisions. So you set up a test to say, hey, every time someone ships code, make sure these 3 checks pass or these 3 tests pass. And that's what Travis pretty much does really well. So that's a commit status. But the cool thing about Travis is that they now use checks as well. So they have everything that you have previously through all that. You can now do with Travis. In addition, you get all that more context and sophisticated feedback. What we're looking at here is the CI/CD pipeline. So if you know continuous integration is a way to automate, another way to automate your workflow. So my first checks in here is source control. So I recommend everybody use GitHub. If you're not using GitHub, definitely check it out. The source control usually starts the process of continuous integration. And then the automated part of your workflow will then run tests in the build step. So as soon as you push your code to GitHub, it'll start running your build. So it'll run your linting, it'll run your tests, and it'll provide those checks and commit statuses here, your PRs. So the whole name of the game is really understand, like, make sure you have build confidence. So if there's something broke in your app, make sure that you have that. Sort of green before you go ahead and ship that to production or merge your PR. And as I mentioned, checks, Travis uses checks. So the whole summary of this is that all the data you normally get on Travis, on travis.com, we're now pulling on the GitHub. So Travis is partnered with us to do that. So now you get more of an idea of what's happening in your build directly in GitHub, as opposed to like going to another URL or another project to look at that. So then the question here is, like, I ask myself all the time, is what would they do? And how would I explain checks? And there's a joke here. It says, when life gives you lemons, listen to lemonade. So with that being said, I built a project, which all I do is just add lyrics to in Markdown. I'll add lyrics to a project. And with that, I can open a pull request, and I'll add my new app to make checks for it. So there's a song that Beyonce wrote actually more than 10 years ago called Check On It. It's not as a popular song, but it exists. It was on the Pink Panther soundtrack, which is a movie no one watched. So more than likely you haven't heard that song. But anyway, I took the lyrics of that song, added to a markdown file, and then I installed this GitHub app. So my coworker built this GitHub app because anybody can build a GitHub app by using Probot or any other tool that you'd like to do. So he built this GitHub app, which is using the linter tool called Alex. And Alex basically goes through your code and checks for sensitivity. So if like you're using curse words or you're using like the wrong gender pronouns, I'll recommend maybe changing your language. I think at the moment it's only based on English language, but it's open source. So if you do want to add any other languages to that, like by all means, definitely check it out. But as I mentioned, on all the pull requests as of this past summer, now has this new tab, which I've highlighted in red, which is your checks tab. So I open up my pull request, I add my new lyrics for the check on it, and then I click on the check tab. And then within the check tab, now I have all these annotations that are recommending me changing language. So using Beyonce language, I was pretty much, I knew that I was going to get some problems with her language because one, it's a pop song. It is not code or documentation. Alex itself is written for like documentation. So if you have documentation that should be improved and a little more sensitive to the verbiage, then that's usually what it's used for. It's not used for pop songs. But with that being said, I use the word girl, and it's recommended me use, instead of girl, use the word kid instead, or child. So that way it's a gender neutral, it could be boy or girl. So with that being said too, I can also click through and imagine this being a more detailed annotation. Maybe there was like some feedback on my code that I could actually have made better. I can actually click through and find out exactly more details on what went wrong. I didn't leave this slide in, but I wanted to mention too as well, GitHub recently, we removed all jQuery from our site. And the way we did it is by actually using this pattern. So we decided about a year ago that we weren't really using jQuery to its fullest, and that most of everything that we could get done in jQuery, we can just use in JavaScript. So we wrote a check to basically check for any jQuery code that was being submitted to pull requests. And then we'd have an annotation that would say, hey, this is jQuery code, here's the equivalent in JavaScript. And then you could actually click through the JavaScript and accept the changes automatically. So it would actually write the code for you in JavaScript if you wrote jQuery. So this is like a super advanced way of using checks. But this kind of shows you like the simplistic version of using the linter version of Beyonce lyrics, and then also our more advanced version of like actually writing for, actually writing like JavaScript code from jQuery, which is like super cool. Like it's something you do in Babel and other tools. I don't know I didn't actually see, we don't use it anymore because we don't have any more jQuery in our code. So I didn't actually see the implementation myself. But the idea of actually running your code and writing code based on the code you wrote is pretty awesome. We have some pretty talented engineers here at GitHub. So I've done an example, which is deployments API. I had a couple of companies ago, I was working on a team. We were a team of 5, and we weren't using continuous integration at all. We just started running tests automatically when I got there. And one of our issues is that we would create new staging environments for our PMs, so that way they can review our code and like thumbs up or thumbs down, whether it was like to their liking. And the problem with that we had one staging environment for every engineer. So I think 2 of the problems that we have as engineers is N+1 queries, and then also naming. So naming's hard. And so we actually took all Simpsons characters. So it's the show that's been going on for like almost 30 years. And we took all these staging environment, we named them different Simpsons characters. And then it got to the point where we ran out of Simpsons characters. So every morning we'd go, like we had a feature to share with other people at the team, we'd grab a staging environment. So we had this command line tool, which was arc which staging. And then I could see that Homer was available. So then I would grab Homer by just running another command, which became tedious because as you can see, we have 4 engineers, 4 staging environments. If we hired a 5th engineer, then we'd have to create a whole nother staging environment just for that one engineer, which is not a bad problem, like not a huge problem to do. The biggest problem is that it costs a lot of money to host servers just for people to use like once a week or once a month. So it wasn't ideal. So I had an idea that I would like to trigger deploys whenever a pull request is open. and offload the management of staging to like basically automation. And I didn't actually build this, but I actually joined the company that did build this. And essentially that's what they do. All they do is they ship staging environments and production environments as soon as you merge PRs or whenever you open up PR. And this is what they're doing. And they're actually using the checks API too as well. So they have a couple features that they're using. So if you ever use Netlify, or if you ever heard of them, definitely check them out. But as far as the CI pipeline situation, they're kind of owning the staging environment situation. And they're doing this all by GitHub webhooks. So their app itself is not built on Probot, but it is a GitHub app. And it's using a lot of the same stuff that I talked about previously. So with that being said, I didn't see any questions. I saw a lot of comments going through. I do have a demo I'd love to show some code in. Actually, let me just show you Probot. So Probot, I focus on Probot because Probot has the best interactions into starting out with GitHub Apps. A lot of the ceremony of like setting up JWTs and setting up all your code, it takes a lot of time. So Probot was created so that you can quickly create a Probot app. So we have a Probot CLI. So if you just do create Probot app, if you ever use React, it's very similar. And it's going to ask you a couple of questions. It's going to infer based on my Git profile a lot of the answers. But it's also going to build a GitHub app for me. So it's going to go ahead and do that for me. And that's as quickly as you can get a Probot app. It'll actually have the code ready. So a lot of the code that we were looking at here, it actually comes by default. So this one right here is the one interaction that you can create. I do recommend leveraging the docs if this does look kind of weird to you. I wasn't planning on showing this GraphQL stuff, but I just got off stage last week speaking about GraphQL, so my examples are in GraphQL. So the Probot team too as well, I do want to mention that we do have a community. So we meet every Friday at 8:30 a.m. So I guess in a couple hours for you. On Fridays, we meet with the open source community, and we basically field questions. So if you have a Probot idea or you have a way that you want to contribute to the open source framework, which you can actually ask questions before you even have to do that. So I think a lot of the hard part about getting the open source is not knowing where to start. And the best way to start is by just showing up to this meeting and raising your hand, asking questions, or just meeting the team. The person in the top left was literally a contributor. So Bex, who is the example, our intern from last year, they contributed to the Probot framework. They actually were one of the second contributors by the creator, who's actually on the right here, Brandon. And we hired them based on their efforts and contributions too. So, I mean, past results is not proven for future result, or past performance is not proven for future results. So, like, I'm not guaranteeing that you would get hired because you contribute to a framework, but I can say in the past we've hired people because they contributed to our open source. So, there's no guarantees, but it's a great way to introduce yourself to a company. So not just GitHub, but a lot of companies do this, like Facebook, Google. If you show up a lot, Microsoft, if you show up in their open source stuff, it's a better way to get a coding interview out of the way than to sit there and do whiteboarding. So just throwing that out there. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and look at my code. I'll get my Andela app and just look at the code that was given to me. And once you go ahead and set this up, as I mentioned, like this is the code that they give you for free. So this is not as simple as adding a label, but every time you open an issue, it's going to say thanks for opening this issue, and that's like the sort of the kickstart you get when you do create Probot app. And then for sake of time, I'll just go ahead and I'll run the example I already have, since I already have that set up, rather than write the code manually, and I'll do some explaining too as I run that. So I'm going to run SME. SME is another tool built by Probot. If you've ever used ngrok, it's like a way to get local tunnels. So if you have a localhost 3000 and you want to test that in production on a URL, you would use like ngrok. SME is like a little simpler to use, and it's also free to use, which basically takes your localhost and grabs it in SME and then presents it as a URL, so you can use that publicly. So that's I guess that's sort of the simplistic way. If you've never done this before, I definitely did not explain that properly, but I'll show you exactly what that does. So I'm basically setting up SME here, and then I'm going to run my Probot app by just simply running npm start. And then I'll show you real quick. So if you went into your github.com, and you went into settings, which is here. If you've never actually been to developer settings, so this is where you get your webhooks, your tokens, your secrets to interact with GitHub's API. Here you can get tokens. Here you can build OAuth apps. And then here you can build GitHub Apps. So I didn't really explain the difference between OAuth and GitHub Apps, but I'll just mention that OAuth apps is the legacy way to interact with our API. GitHub Apps are a solution because you get fine-grained controls on interactions. So what that means is OAuth apps, if you build an OAuth app and you log in with the OAuth app, my app gets access to all your data. With GitHub Apps, it only gets access to the data that gets requested. So that's the biggest difference. And we built GitHub Apps as a solution to the problem of a lot of companies and a lot of people don't want to give all their data away. They work at companies, or they working on projects they don't want to share publicly or have to give people access to. So with that reason, they prefer GitHub Apps. I didn't mention too, if you want to build a new GitHub app, you will have to do this. So Probot doesn't do this for you. There is the new way that we haven't shipped yet to automatically do this, filling out this form for you, which essentially just basically picks what sort of data you want access to. So I only want read and write access data to issues. And then I only want to watch webhooks for issues, because that's the only thing I'll have an example for. But what I was talking about before OAuth apps, you can't choose just this. You do have to get all of the stuff included. So that's sort of the biggest difference. But I won't build a new Probot app. I'll just use my existing one here, where I actually already filled out the form. Also, one thing to note is that my SME URL, I'm putting this here because every time the GitHub app or a webhook fires for my GitHub app, I want to call it from SME directly. So that's what this is for. I can have an authorization callback URL. So if someone offs through GitHub, I can provide a different URL. Like if I was using, like, for example, netlify.com, I would redirect to netlify.com because I want them back on my platform. But because my app itself has no website, I'll just put them on GitHub. You do get a public URL too as well. So if you do want to share your app publicly and have other people install it, you can do so by just sharing this URL as well. But with that being said, I am going to, I closed the wrong tab. So here you go, back on this tab. So yeah, and the other thing too is, well, you can set up a webhook secret. So if you're really concerned about security, you can change your secret here, and as well as add a logo. Other thing to note is that your app ID is here, and that you do have to generate a private key, and I'll show you why too as well. So with Probot, again, we do all this work for you. The private key here, this is the private key that I generated from GitHub in the settings. I've set a webhook secret, and I set my app ID here in my .env file. The URL I talked about in like the second slide, there's a URL. It actually goes in way more detail about why you want to set this and why you want to use this. But this basically points to the right app, which is going to be my bot. I named it bot 7652, mainly because I write a lot of bots. As I mentioned before, N+1 queries and naming are hard. So I named them super generic, so that way I just can identify which one I'm trying to play with. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I'll show you. I'm running the app right now here, and I'm gonna go ahead and go to my repo. So in my repo itself, I've installed this app directly on here. Normally, if I didn't already have this installed, it would say install, but I'm just going to show you that this repo here, bot test repo, it has this GitHub app installed. So, and this is the repo I'm on, bot test repo. So the one interaction they have already that I didn't go ahead and write for you, but right here, is every time an issue is open, I want to add a comment saying, thank you for opening this issue. So this is like simulating, like if someone opens an issue, simulating the fact that, hey, we saw you, we want to get to this, but for now, we're not gonna, we'll get to this when we can. So if you want to provide more context on your project, so hello world, and then yada yada. So I'm gonna open up this issue, and I should have a comment that shows up, but I'll show you in the terminal that you can see on my, because I'm running this locally. So normally you push this to production, but because I'm running on a local host, I can now, because it's me, I can now see that my issue itself was already added. So it was pretty quick itself. So issue.created happened, which is the event, and then my issue itself got open. So I'll show you with the power of refreshing. I now have a bot that says, hey, thanks for opening issue. The other thing that I added here using GraphQL, which is the example that the individual asked, I want to add a comment, and I'm using that in GraphQL instead. So the biggest difference is that instead of content.github, our context. So context itself, so Probot gives you this for free. It provides context of the repo that was that made the webhooks fire, as well as the user that made the webhook fire, as well as like way more data of that exact event. So that's what the context is. And I call GraphQL by just calling query on the context, and I'll add that comment. So this one is, actually I already forgot what this was. Oh, so if, I think this is not if a label is added. Oh yeah, if an issue is labeled, it should say hello world. I don't think this one's actually firing. I think this one actually is an error. But we'll see. Let's just put a label on there and see if we get the comment. Oh yeah, it works. I guess I fixed this. All right, so yeah, so whenever I add a label, it's super trivial. Like these are super trivial contrived examples, but mainly to show you that you can interact with your repos and your workflow by simply just setting up bots. So with Probot itself, we do give in the docs, there are a list of different webhooks. If you want to find out more context and how that works, so you can check out there, but I did want to show webhook events. So these are all the webhook events that you could fire different actions in GitHub Apps on. So every time someone does a deployment, every time someone deletes something, creates a check, adds a new member, like GitHub pages, you can run actions of that. You can run actions on gists, statuses. So all these actions are these webhooks are available to you to provide context to or enhancements to your workflow. So that's pretty much the example I've got. I did have a few more slides that I'll properly share my screen for. So if people are taking notes or want to see that URL again. Yeah, you did mention this too, Mercy. I do run the GitHub Developer Program. So this is a program to better engage people who interact with our API, so who are building on our API. So if you want context around GraphQL or context around GitHub Apps, or just opportunity to talk to people from GitHub to solve some of your problems, definitely sign up for the GitHub Developer Program. So that way you can provide another way to sort of interact with GitHub. And that's the URLs here on the bottom, developer.github.com/program. This was the URL I mentioned in the beginning that goes through everything I talked about. The one thing I didn't talk about is actually deploying your app to a function, but I do cover this in the actual serverless example. And then the website itself for Probot is probot.github.io. Hopefully we'll see some of you Friday in the Friday meeting. Just ask questions, meet the team, find out different ideas of Probot apps you can build. Also, I want to mention too, GitHub Marketplace is a way for, as I mentioned, pull reminders. Abi, he's a solo developer, one guy in Chicago. He's making about $6,000 a month on one app, which is great for him because he's quit his job when he's doing that full time. And he's enjoying life because he doesn't have to work for anybody, just kind of shipping code for this. So he's doing that because he shipped his Probot app to GitHub Marketplace. So Marketplace is an e-commerce platform for if anybody wants to like make money with their application, you can do this on Marketplace. And it's simply similar to like the iOS store. You submit your app for approval, and we'll provide feedback. Like if your logo is in high res, we'll tell you that, or if there's something wrong with your API or if it's broken, we'll have QA for you to ship that to marketplace. So definitely check that out. And this is my information again. So developer advocate Brian Douglas. I do have an email. Our team email is developer@github.com. So if you do have questions, definitely let me know.